Piotti. I'm the president of American Farmland Trust, and I'm here today to discuss a new book with two authorities on conservation agriculture, a transformative movement that has involved farmers and ranchers and conservationists and policymakers and academics. It's unfolded mostly outside of public view, but it really has had an outsized impact on America's landscape, our environment, and our economy. Don Stuart is the author of No Farms, No Food, Uniting Farmers and Environmentalists to Transform American Agriculture. Don, it's great to have you here. Don's written several books, though I think it's fair to say that this one is really a true product of the heart. Don cares deeply about farmland conservation and other issues where agriculture and the environment come together. Years ago, he served on the staff of American Farmland Trust, running our Pacific Northwest office. And in preparation for this book, he did considerable research, including conducting extensive interviews with a number of key persons, one of whom is our other guest. Ralph, great to have you here. For over 40 years, Ralph Grossi has played a pivotal role advancing conservation agriculture in America. A dairy farmer, and I guess you guys call them dairy ranchers out there, but I'll say dairy farmer. A dairy farmer from Marin County, California. Ralph was a founder of the first land trust that focused on protecting farmland in our nation. And soon thereafter, he was recruited to be part of the team that founded American Farmland Trust. That was in 1980. He served on AFT's board for 5 years and then became AFT's second president, a position he held for an astonishing 23 years. I'm not a quarter of that tenure, and I'm already worn out. I don't know how you did it, Ralph, but really very, very impressive. He continued his service to AFT in different ways after that. And a couple of years ago, he agreed to come back on AFT's board, and he now serves as the chair of our policy committee. So before I dive into this interview, I'm going to take just a moment to stress why every American should care about the story that Don has written. And simply put, it is because we all eat and we all live on this planet. Now, it's gratifying that more and more Americans are showing an interest in farming. They care about where our food is grown. They increasingly see the connections between farming and climate change. Great to see that. Compared to the 1980, it's a sea change in public attitudes. And why has that happened? Well, I think a lot of reasons, including AFT's work over the years, but I also think part of it has been all the books and movies that have been out there. Some of them have showcased good farmers following good practices. And in some cases, the books and movies have spotlighted a broken system that needs reform. But until now, there's never been a book that traces the history of the conservation agriculture movement. Yet knowing that history, knowing about the people who are involved, knowing what actions worked and what didn't, it's fascinating. It's hopeful, and it's also really useful. You know, this is a story of a small but little known movement that within just a few decades has really revolutionized public attitudes towards food and the environment. At the same time, it is an unfinished story. The strategies that were followed, what worked and what didn't, provide needed guidance for the future. A future that demands that we get agriculture right. So Don, I'm going to begin with you and ask you to take us back to the 1970s. What was different about agriculture back then? What issues led to the creation of AFT?
Well, I think maybe the biggest single thing I would identify was the explosion of prosperity after World War II. It led to, among other things, some very rapid growth that was really dramatically occurring in our cities along about the 1980s. And if you looked around, everywhere you looked, you saw farms disappearing under pavement. And that really was the inception of the whole thing. We had a national environmental land study that later documented some 3 million acres disappearing from agriculture every single year, most of it falling into development. And also, these were not just any lands; these were some of our very best farmlands. And I think people looked around, they saw that happening. Secondly, you had an environmental revolution taking place. You had new laws passing in Congress over that decade prior to 1980 that were just a dramatic, I think probably a dozen or so major environmental laws: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, the list goes on. And that had to be not only noticeable, but kind of intimidating to the people that owned half of the land in this country and who farmed that land. So an activity that sort of necessity has impact on the environment of some kind. They certainly saw all of this coming in their direction. And I think they were probably nervous about it. They were also facing new competition because you had an explosion at the same time of international trade. So they were every single farm product, not just the dry bulk commodities, but everything was in competition in international trade. And then finally, the only solutions to those problems were regulatory. There were no incentives. There were no incentive programs, period, at the time, not anything meaningful, at least, to deal with, sort of direct efforts to change how people behaved in farming. And when it came to urban edge issues and controlling growth, there were no conservation easement, purchase and development rights programs to speak of. There were a couple sprinkled here and there, but for the most part, that also didn't exist. So the only solution there was also regulatory. It was zoning. And I think all of that came together. People saw it coming, and I think they were kind of a natural setting for the formation of AFT.
Yeah. Well, there were a few forward-looking people, as you know, who saw these trends, saw both environmentalists and farmers at odds, and thought there really needed to be a better way. That environmental issues and agricultural issues really were the two sides of the same coin. I find the story of AFT's creation fascinating. Peggy Rockefeller, who was a key part of that group of people, forward-thinking people, she served on the board of the Nature Conservancy at the time and suggested that TNC, which of course today does a lot of great things in ag, but didn't back then, that they could become that organization to embrace both agriculture and the environment. What happened there? How did that story turn out?
Well, I gotta say, if I was Patrick Noonan at the time, heading TNC, and Peggy Rockefeller, the wife of David Rockefeller, who was sort of the Bill Gates of his age, had come to me and wanted this to happen, I'd have found it very difficult to tell her no. But they did, and for good reason. They'd really focused TNC on being a targeted to the very most sensitive, environmentally productive lands. It was really focused in, and for them to start bringing farmers into their picture at that time, at least, would have been a dramatic change. New board members, new staff, new expertise, and some serious explanations, I think, to their donors, who I think many of whom very probably saw farmers as the enemy rather than as potential allies. So they ended up, as you say, forming an entirely new organization. Before they did that, they did a search nationwide and basically had the same results. Nobody really that represented agriculture felt comfortable including the environmental community, and vice versa. So the bottom line was they formed a new organization. She, I think, referred to it, as I understand it, as the TNC of agriculture. And she enlisted a really impressive board of directors. Herself, of course. Pat Noonan later came on board. Fred Winthrop, who was the commissioner of ag for Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts. Bill Riley, a future EPA director. And of course, Ralph, who had been the founder of, I think, the first farmland agricultural land trust in the country. So I credit, and I might add, some amazing staff, including Norm Berg and others, people with a lot of incredible credentials. And I just would say that I credit the existence of those amazing people and the vision, the breadth of the vision that they had. I think that really, in the end, is what accounts for what ultimately happened in AFT's subsequent evolution.
Yeah. It's truly an amazing story. And Ralph, you were there from the beginning, not yet as AFT's president, but as a founder and a board member, and of course, as a farmer, trying to make a living in this age. And later in this interview, I'm going to ask you to talk about AFT's early work. But I want to start with just an understanding of the agricultural landscape in 1980. It was a very different place than today, particularly when it comes to conservation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, be glad to. I think Don set the context very well in terms of the macro scale of what was happening, and so timing is everything, as you know, and timing is really important for AFT here. There was not only the post-war expansion of suburbia, which was rapidly taking over some of our very best farmland in the country, not surprisingly, because many of these cities were agrarian beginnings and were formed where the best farmland existed, and so growth would naturally occur on the best farmland. Post-war, this is happening rapidly. Here in my home state of California, both Los Angeles County and Santa Clara County were ranked the #1 and #3 counties in the state for agriculture in the late 50s. So think about that for a moment. And at the same time, the birth and rapid emergence of the environmental movement, kicked off largely by Silent Spring and some of the other initiatives of the 60s and early 70s, led to the kind of regulatory response that Don was talking about at the national level. But it also was happening at the local level. You know, in my county here north of San Francisco, there was a lot of concern about how rapidly farmland was being taken over by new housing developments. And so our county in the early 70s took the only tool they had, which is zoning, in a kind of meat-axe approach to rectifying that problem by rezoning a large portion of the county, which at the time allowed 1.5 units per acre, and changed that to 1 unit per 60 acres. That was a dramatic move by the county. So add that to the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the emergence of Environmental Protection Agency, and you can imagine how farmers were feeling. They were feeling seriously put upon and at risk, not just in terms of the land available for production, but whether or not they would be able to continue the practices they had emerged for over the past half century. So that conflict naturally set up the opportunity for some people who were looking for solutions to move toward the center to find what we began to call the middle ground approach. How can we find a way to achieve environmental goals and conservation goals while at the same time meeting the needs of agriculture to feed a growing population? And I think that's why AFT early on was looked to as a breath of fresh air, an organization that was thinking about the middle ground. And in fact, there was a book written by Chuck Little that explored the term middle ground around that time. Couple that with the National Agricultural Land Study, which highlighted the loss of farmland, and there was clearly a need for another organization. I tip my hat to the Nature Conservancy for giving us the genetics, if you will, to form AFT, not just the people involved. Peggy Rockefeller Pat Noonan, but also they had already begun to recognize that there is a large landscape out there. And if you're really going to have an impact on the environment, you had to find a way to work with agriculture. But they had made a commitment to biodiversity, and they stuck to their guns on that when they told Peggy that this was not going to be included in their mission, agriculture protection. And so that set the stage. I can, Don, like you, I can imagine the conversation between Pat Noonan and Peggy Rockefeller. Peggy was not one to take things lightly. When she was determined, things got done. And I can imagine that, in fact, Pat said, well, really, maybe we need to start another organization, Peggy. Can you and your network and the Rockefeller family, are you willing to support that effort? And so I was, of course, involved in forming the Marin Agricultural Land Trust as the County Farm Bureau president at the time. And I got a call from someone in Pat's office and said, can you come to a meeting in Washington about the National Agricultural Land Study? And so that was kind of the beginning with Fred Winthrop and others in forming AFT.
It is indeed a fascinating story, and it worked out. So that's great. But you mentioned, a recognition of incredible need, coupled with opportunity. What you haven't mentioned is the fact that there were nonetheless very few tools that were available, right? I mean, Marin Agricultural Land Trust, the only entity in the country that was protecting farmland specifically at that time. There were two state farmland protection programs then, one in Delaware, one in Massachusetts, that Fred Winthrop had set up, that were organized well, but had barely started their work. Otherwise, there were no state programs. The IRS didn't recognize a donated easement as a charitable contribution. And then on the farming practice side, we think today about the Farm Bill and all these great conservation programs. None of those existed. So, I often make the point to people, 1980 was only 42 years ago, but the landscape in conservation was completely different. And, of course, AFT is focused both on the farmland protection side and on the farming practice side. And I want us to talk about both in turn. But I'm going to start, Ralph, by asking you some questions about farmland protection. And, in our early days, we had some early successes there. We got the Farmland Protection Policy Act enacted as part of the 81 Farm Bill, then went on to help various states, ultimately loop back to making things happen with federal policy as well. But talk a little bit about that history with farmland protection.
Yeah, so I think picking up on the regulatory approach, clearly given the politics of the moment and still the politics today around respect for private property rights and the political strength of the farm community, the idea, the concept of the middle ground, which includes compensation, is really an important part of the concept that AFT seized on early on. And our rationale was simple. And the rationale was that the protection of land and the improvement of practices on the land and the protection of open spaces around our cities, not to mention food production capacity, was a clear public benefit that flows from the private lands of agriculture. And if we were going to truly achieve something important, we were going to have to find a way to recognize the value of that public benefit. Unfortunately, we didn't have many tools at the time, as you mentioned. You could donate a conservation easement and take a tax deduction. In my community, farmers weren't looking for tax deductions. That was not a problem. We had to have income. We had to make a living and survive on the land. So we needed something else. And there was this experiment going on in Massachusetts, I believe Connecticut, a couple of other states, around the idea of purchasing the development rights instead of just a donation, but actually compensating the landowner. And a local environmentalist actually sent me an article from Maryland in 1978, which I put in my file, about purchase and transfer of development rights, this new concept. And, lo and behold, that to me, that became a really important tool to work with going forward. But there was a lot of work to be done because our Marin Agricultural Land Trust was the first one to even try to do that, trying to buy development rights. There were lots of issues related to, as you mentioned, IRS recognition. At the time, remember, the Internal Revenue Service didn't recognize farmland protection as a public benefit, even though certainly many of us did. So there was a lot of work to do early on, and there was a need to find revenue streams, and of course that led us to the Farm Bill as a potential source of public support for agriculture going forward.
Yeah, I want to go a little deeper on farmland protection for just a second. And of course, it's only one part of what AFT does, but it's a big part because it really wasn't happening much before we got in this space. And the numbers are pretty impressive in that there were about 10,000 acres of farmland that had been protected when we had been founded by, a couple of state programs, a couple of land trusts that had done farm deals. Again, malt being the only one that really focused on agriculture, and now that number's up to close to 7 million acres. It's a great success story, and AFT really played a hand in pretty much all of the state programs that were created. We also helped found a number of other agricultural land trusts, and we provided services to existing land trusts who wanted to get involved in ag, as well as pushing on with the IRS and the like, a flurry of activity. And I'm going to get back to you in a moment, Ralph, to talk about the other area of a flurry of activity with farming practices. But I just want to give Don a chance to talk about why you think AFT could have such an outsized impact on the farmland protection space. What was it about our DNA or the people or whatever that allowed us to go in 1980 to just help create all of these programs, support all these land trusts, and today have a track record of close to 7 million acres that are protected? What drove that?
Well, I guess I'd still have to say it went back to an early board with vision. Mm-hmm. Because you had a huge problem. There were 3 million acres of important land going away every year, and if you were going to treat yourself and behave, I guess, in the very constrained sort of traditional way that land trusts sometimes do, I think that they looked around and they didn't see the getting there. They didn't see the scope of that solution matching the scope of the problem. And that inevitably, I believe, led them to realize that it had to be work in the policy arena. And if this new, small, little known, and I might add, strange organization that respected both farmers and environmentalists, who on earth would do that? If this group was going to get anything done, it had to happen in the policy arena. And that meant it had to have help from both farmers and environmentalists. I think if you're going to go into a legislative session, walk into a legislator's office or a member of Congress and say, look, I've got this great program for protecting farmland, the first question you're going to get asked is, well, okay, so I don't know who you are, but where are the farmers on this? And I might add, you'd walk into the other half of the legislators' offices and they'd say, well, where are the environmentalists on this? What do they say about protecting all this farmland? If you didn't have those people on board, if you had to say, well, I don't really know, or they're neutral, or no, they're against it, you were history. You'd have been out of that office and that would have been the end of it. So they had to do something. And I think is really what led, that was the nexus of what I think doubtless led to the necessity of joining and working together with both farmers and environmentalists, and the evolution of a whole sort of AFT strategy surrounding that collaborative effort.
And
so Don, if I don't,
Ralph.
I jump in because this is an important point here. I think we have to give credit not just to that early board of directors, but our first president, Doug Wheeler, who recognized right away that this was much bigger than a little organization could tackle. And you had to have a strategy that made sense. And the strategy, of course, had to do with a lot of need for policy change, recognition of farmland protection, the shifting of resources, that sort of thing. But to do that, you needed a strategy that educated both the public, not just the public, but farmers and environmentalists about this middle ground approach, the use of easements as a tool. And it was going to need demonstration projects. Somebody was going to have to get out there and help do projects around the country to show that this wasn't just an idea, that it could happen on the ground. And so I think that three-legged stool of policy development, public education, and demonstration projects was a very effective early strategy that Doug and the board put in place almost immediately.
Ralph, when I came on board, when I first joined the organization, one of the very first things I did was go to the Land Trust Alliance meeting, annual meeting, and I just was amazed at that effort. I don't know who paid for that. What I mean is it had to be AFT donors and that paid for those efforts, but that went on for years and years. I mean, that was 20 years in, and AFT was still intimately involved in educating and supporting and helping the land trust community get engaged in this.
Well, and it led to the formation of the Farmland Information Center, which became the go-to clearinghouse for land trusts all over the country. Today, it is morphed into the network, but it's a very important function of an organization, and as you know, very hard to continue to support because it is kind of generic in nature. That is, we're going to educate people.
Yeah. Well, the strategies that you've outlined, having a good vision, having capable people working on that middle ground, focusing on policies, focusing on education, that really served our efforts to advance farmland protection. It also really served our other focus area, which became advancing farming practices. And Ralph, talk a little bit about that track. Talk about the Conservation Coalition, Norm Berg, the '85 Farm Bill, everything that happened there.
Yeah. Well, again, timing, right? The National Agricultural Land Study was the impetus for the farmland protection movement. But around that time, in the early '80s, soil erosion had become a serious issue in this country, partly because so much land had been broken out that was, we referred to it as the sod busting, particularly in the plains states. So we had serious soil erosion problems, maybe nearly as bad as it had been in the Dust Bowl era, contributing to a lot of environmental problems. And at that very moment in the early '80s, agriculture was in trouble. Farms were going bankrupt. There was a serious problem related to the stability of agriculture. And so there were a lot of things that were kind of coming together around the 1985 Farm Bill. AFT staff, and this is where Bob Gray and Norm Berg came in. Bob had been on Congressman Jeffords' staff and had been appointed as one of the directors of the National Agricultural Land Study. That was released in early 1981, and Bob came on board at AFT to help the movement move forward based on that study. Norm Berg had been a longtime staff at USDA, was the chief of what was then the Soil Conservation Service, as now the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And when the Reagan administration came in, they politicized that position and brought in a new chief of Soil Conservation Service. And so Norm was out of a job, and the Soil and Water Conservation Society, who we were partnering with, said, gee, can you help us in our Washington office? And came to AFT and asked if Norm could have an office at AFT. That's a short story to say, a way to say that Norm eventually came on the staff at AFT. But Norm and Bob put together a study called, let me get this, make sure I get this right. Soil Conservation in America, What Do We Have to Lose? And that became the Bible for the 1985 Farm Bill, because in that report that resulted from that study, they outlined the problems, not just with farmland protection, but with water quality, soil erosion, et cetera, and made recommendations, different recommendations, and including conservation compliance, which we still are working on today. But one of the recommendations was what became the Conservation Reserve Program. And that focused attention, I believe, on the farm practices issue. So, John, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but it set the stage for AFT to not just be a farmland protection group, but one that's also concerned about the quality of the land and how we were stewarding the land. And so the Conservation Reserve Program became the leading issue in the 85 conservation title, the first conservation title to ever appear in a farm bill, and maybe more importantly, raised the total dollars that were committed to conservation. And so that was our early foray into the farming practices side, was conservation, soil conservation, and the 85 Farm Bill, and made AFT, I wouldn't say a household name, but certainly a well-known entity around Washington in that debate over the 85 Farm Bill.
Well, the 85 Farm Bill is viewed now as really being transformational, right? It included the first conservation title and really set the stage. And I think by our last calculation, something like $120 billion has flowed to farmers since that time to take actions that do right by the land. It's really been as I said, a transformational thing. But it didn't happen overnight. AFT had an outsized role in that. We led the Conservation Coalition that created it. But policy change, you can look back at it and say that was transformational. But there's been a heck of a lot of work since then, including a lot of hard work in the trenches, working with the bureaucracy on rulemaking and the like, and then all the subsequent changes of future farm bills that AFT also had a hand in. So, Ralph, talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about how AFT kept its eye on the prize, played the long game, and kept this thing moving forward.
So I was mid-'80s when I just arrived at AFT. I had lunch with the head of the Wilderness Society, and he said, we started this organization a long time ago, and it was almost 40 years before we got the Williamson Act passed, the Wilderness Act, passed. And that struck me as that's long game. That was an organization that was committed, their mission was committed, and they stuck to their issues and got the Wilderness Act passed. And it reminded me that policy is incremental generally. While the 85 Farm Bill was quite transformational in many ways, it really is incremental. And so, every 4, 5, or 6 years, there's a Farm Bill, and it is the best opportunity to make incremental changes. It's also true at the state level that you get one state and then a neighboring state, and you get a little stronger program, and it just keeps moving, and you have to hang in there for the long haul, because eventually it happens. And so, look at AFT, 1980 founding, 16 years to get farmland protection in a farm bill in a significant way, and another 12 years after that to get significant funding committed to conservation easements. And so, that's just a reminder that when you're in the trenches day to day, month to month, year to year, it's really important to keep your eye on what's possible down the road.
Your example of it taking to 1996 to get the Farm and Ranch Protection Program into federal law is also useful because it points out how AFT went down different tracks at different times to affect change. A lot of our work with farmland protection was focused on state and private activity, supporting land trusts, getting state programs when there wasn't movement at the federal level, even though AFT and Jim Jeffords and others were trying to make it happen. So we had the long game on federal farmland protection program. At the same time, we were working on where we could affect change at the state and more regional level.
Yeah, I would point out that key states like Pennsylvania, Colorado, California were important in and of themselves, but they also helped us build the congressional support that we needed for the farm policy. These are related issues.
Mm-hmm.
Local, state, and federal policy work is all related. I'll tip my hat right now to one staff person, Bob Wagner, who managed that state level activity for many years for us, and who was very good at helping bring the states along. And I know he worked with Don in the Pacific Northwest. That was important work, even though it might have seemed like one-off activities in various places. It really was contributory to the bigger picture.
Don, your book really does a great job of identifying some of the key features that have made AFT effective. And Ralph alluded to one of them earlier, our focus from the beginning on that middle ground. You really stress that a lot in the book and sort of tweak out what that means and where it's worked and how. And I want each of you, but I'm going to start with you, Don. I want each of you to just go in a little further on that and talk about what the middle ground or the radical center, whatever you want to call it, what that means to you and how important in your mind that's been to our success and what it means for the future, particularly in this increasingly polarized political environment we live in.
Well, it's easy to oversimplify, right? Really, collaboration, negotiation is a subject of academic study. There are people that write books and work their lives, and there are, college curricula on the topic. So that's not the level at which I kind of understand this. I would say for me, it's somewhat simpler. It was AFT's resolution right from the start that it was going to be an organization, and the people that worked for AFT were going to be advocates for farmers and environmentalists, for both farms and for the environment. Not one, not the other, always for both at the same time, which sounds maybe, or might have sounded at the outset like something that was pretty unlikely and difficult to accomplish. In reality, as I think all of this emerged, it was sort of resulted in some fairly amazing principles. Ralph alluded to one of them, and that was a very heavy reliance on research, on foundational facts. You're going along, you think of an idea and you think, gee, if I only knew this fact. And lo and behold, you do the research, then you have the fact in hand. It's stuff people can rely upon, and that provides a foundation for both sides to develop their positions, to understand where it's going. I think there were a whole series of principles, things like creative problem solving, things like speaking always the truth and developing credibility, always speaking the same truth, maybe in a different language. But always speaking the same truth to both sides. All of that, to me, was kind of a critical part of what AFT was up to during this time. And I feel like this notion of collaboration was at the heart of what we could accomplish. And I don't think it's surprising. In fact, I think the notion of the power of all of this is not maybe obvious at first until you kind of put yourself in the position, say, of a legislator. I mean, imagine that you're a newly elected member of Congress or state legislator, and you ran for office. You have good intents. You have good intent. You want to do the right thing. Maybe what you think the right thing is might not always be the same as somebody else, but that's your intent. You're trying to be a useful member of society. I think also you like to be liked. You want to be respected. So you show up there on the first day, and what you discover is there are literally thousands of bills that you have to possibly look at. I mean, like 4,000 or 5,000 bills just in the Washington State Legislature each session. And every one of those bills, or the vast majority, have people that love the bill and another bunch of people that just hate it. And so let me tell you, the last thing on earth you want to do is vote on any of those bills. You just don't want to have to do it. Yeah, there are some that are going to be political party bills, yes, but every time you vote on one of those bills, one side or the other, you're going to make half of those people into bitter enemies. And it's not really what you signed up to do. So that's part of what explains why the legislative process in this country is actually designed to provide a lot of barriers to getting anything passed. There are huge hurdles, dozens of them, all the way down the road, step by step by step, to prevent a bill from passing. But usually there's only sort of one clear, bright path to success. And that's sort of by intent. So it's not, we all think, oh, we've got to fight the good fight. We've got to get in there and do the right thing. Somehow, it seems like it's a cop-out if you compromise. The fact is, if you're in the legislative arena and you don't compromise, I'm sorry, it just doesn't happen. It doesn't go anywhere. Picture you're that legislator and you're sitting in a hearing, and they call up the next bill. They call up testimony on the next bill, and the chair says, well, let's have two people from each side. Let's start off with pro. We'll have two people in favor come up here and testify. And so two people walk forward. One of them is the lobbyist, or maybe the CEO, president of the American Farm Bureau Federation. And the other one, you think, okay, that person sits down, then the other person sits down, and you look and you take a double take. Holy smoke. It's the CEO or lobbyist for the Nature Conservancy, or maybe for the Sierra Club. And let me just tell you, when those two people sit down together at the same table to testify, everything else is irrelevant. What they say, what happens later, what the arguments are, it's finished. That bill right then, in that moment, that bill has passed.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that is the power of collaboration. That
Yeah.
is what you can get accomplished with collaboration.
And as you know, Don, I served for many years in the state legislature in Maine and chaired the Ag Committee. And what you say is so true. Ralph,
Yeah.
you live this. You've lived this world. You ran an organization for 23 years that made hay by focusing on this common ground and bringing practical, research-based, common sense solutions to problems. Give us your take on this.
Let me just first pick up on Don's point about collaboration, because whether it was the 85 Farm Bill and that big conservation title, or the 96 Farm Bill, which included the emergence of the EQIP program, or the 2008 Farm Bill, which ended up giving us real conservation easement programs, collaboration was key to it. And I want to mention a couple of organizations that were really important in the beginning, because some of those conservation/environmental groups were more inclined to try to understand the agriculture community. And groups like, we mentioned the Nature Conservancy, but groups like Ducks Unlimited, and the Audubon Society, I think, bear mention because they played really important roles in helping us educate the agriculture community and find the middle ground. But when it comes to the middle ground, to me, it boils down to one word, and the word is fairness. Fairness in how we achieve public benefits on private land, and how it's fair to both the landowner and the taxpayer. And at the heart of what AFT has done all these years is to try to find that point. We're not always perfect in finding it, and we're still figuring out what a conservation easement is worth, for example, and that's changing a little bit over time. But that fairness is important in communicating to the farm community that this isn't just about regulating you again, but in recognizing the public benefits that you produce on your farm or ranch. The open space, the wildlife habitat, the cleaner water, the access to local foods, these are all public benefits that flow from private lands. And finding in it's the root of the conflict over property rights in this country. And we've gone through property rights and the Sagebrush Rebellion and a number of issues over the years, and sometimes violent confrontations over property rights. But in the end, to me, it comes down to fairness. Are we doing it in a way that's fair to both the landowner and the taxpayer? Not too much regulation, not too much compensation. Where's the middle? And AFT's been the lead organization in trying to find that middle as it shifts back and forth.
It has been a very successful strategy for us. It's made a world of difference. It's made a world of difference, not just to the organization, but to agriculture, to our planet. Can it be continued? Does that strategy still work in today's times? Curious to hear from both of you.
John, not only can it be continued, it has to be continued. We are in much more polarized times right now. And if there was ever a time when we have to talk about fairness and the middle ground, it's right now when we are so polarized politically. I think it's important to note that what achievements AFT has been able to participate in over the years have happened under both Democratic and Republican administrations, Democratic and Republican majorities in Congress. Just one little footnote to that. When I arrived at AFT as a very green, very naive dairy farmer from California, the Reagan administration was in power, and the Secretary of Agriculture was John Block. And as an indication that Jack Block recognized this issue, he held a reception for me in the patio at USDA, announcing my hiring by AFT. As I look back on that, that was quite remarkable,
extraordinary,
actually, for a secretary to do that. And I believe now that it was his signal that this middle ground approach that AFT had been talking about for 5 years had some merit, and he was going to give it a little bit of light that day.
That's great. Don, we've talked about farming practices. We've talked about farmland protection, which are really the two threads of conservation agriculture. But AFT's work is actually broader than those two things, even though they're both important. We have a three-legged mission, as we all know. It's about the land itself, the practices on the land, and the people who steward that land. And we sometimes express it as keeping farmers on the land. It has to do with farm viability. It has to do with recruiting the next generation. Talk to us a little bit about how that third piece came about, how it became part of AFT's focus and our DNA.
Well, exactly. It's great to protect agricultural land. And it's great to make sure that it's farmed in a way that is responsible and friendly to the environment. But if the farm on that land cannot stay in business, you don't have a farmer, you don't have a farm, and that land goes elsewhere. And maybe if the farmer goes out of business for whatever reason, maybe there'll be another farmer that wants to buy that property, but that farmer's going to face exactly the same problems that the first one did. So you got to face it. If you don't create a climate in which that farm business can succeed and prosper, really the rest of it is honestly, it's just sort of smoke and dope. It isn't going to happen. It's you've got to have a viable farm business for this whole thing to work. And it also helps to appreciate that if you lose the farm, in most parts of this country, or a great many parts of this country, on much of the very most valuable agricultural land, that isn't going back to native forest. It will fall into the hands of someone who wants to make a more intensive use of it. What the real estate industry calls the highest and best use, right? And that will be more intensive than agriculture. You can guarantee it. It will probably be a shopping mall or a housing development or something of that order, and that farm is gone. And when that farm is gone, when that property has been converted, it's permanent. And you will never, after that, ever again have an opportunity to improve its environmental performance as a farm. You're never going to get habitat out of a housing development. And you can pretty well write off all of those amazing opportunities that we have in agricultural land to store carbon in the soil, to grow trees on the perimeter, to use practices that help the farm be more responsible environmentally. All of that's out the window. So just the fact that that farm exists is hugely important, as are the opportunities to improve it. But all of that depends upon that third leg of the stool. You have to have all three. And I would sort of include in that third leg, still using the terminology of sustainability, you need a sustainable farm business. Mm-hmm. And in that, that obviously includes economic sustainability, but it also includes, I think of as sort of social sustainability, and I also think political sustainability. I always felt that we really need to help our ag industry, and I don't think there can be any kind of shortcut around that. We need the public to be supportive of, to be in love with, and to be prepared to support and assist our agriculture industry, especially with respect to these conservation practices, and especially with respect to protection of the land, because these are things that, depending on the practice or the activity, can be more or less expensive. And also, they're things that the farmer may not be able to afford. And the last thing you want to do is drive that farmer out of business. So all of that, to me, leads to a kind of a third nature of kind of sustainability, and sort of political sustainability. I want to see our farmers integrated into society in a way that's all of us love our farms and appreciate all of the things that they do for us.
At the staff level now, we often talk about how AFT takes this holistic approach, and all these pieces are interconnected and they feed on each other. And, maybe the origin of AFT was that there weren't other groups at that time who weren't connecting agriculture and environmental issues. And today, that's not the case. Today, there are many groups who do that. Environmental groups see farmers as partners. Farm groups understand the value of conservation. But maybe today, AFT's value added is I really think we are the only national organization that sees all those connections between the land itself, the practices on the land, the people that steward the land, their economic sustainability, whether the next generation can be brought on the land to be successful. All of those issues are interconnected. It's a very powerful angle.
John.
Yeah, please.
Just to pick up a little bit on this issue of economic sustainability, we've always looked for the win-wins. Like any good policy team, you're looking for win-wins. And looking forward, climate change may very well present one of those win-wins where by securing and fixing carbon in the soil, we not only make a significant contribution to the fight over climate change or around climate change, but we also improve the quality of the land and the long-term productivity of that land.
Yep.
Again, though, that productivity doesn't show up the next year. It takes time to build soil. And here's one of those potential win-wins. And I hope, and I know AFT is approaching it that way, that this is both good for the environment, good for future generations, and good for future farmers. And we just have to find a way to make it work.
Well, that's a great segue to where I wanted to bring the conversation next, because your book is it talks about challenges and opportunities before us, and the front and center one is, of course, the climate crisis. And the flip side of the crisis is that, as Ralph just pointed out, agriculture done right can make a real difference. We can trap atmospheric carbon, we can put it back in the soil. And AFT, of course, has played a major role in this for a while. We've been about soil health for decades. We played a leading role, as you point out in the book, Don, in 2008, 2009 with Waxman-Markey, which was really the first effort by Congress to try to link ag and climate. And of course, that passed in the House but failed in the Senate. And in some ways, AFT suffered some setbacks after that with a lack of funding and the like. And public attention was really not front and center on climate and ag issues for a few years. But that's changed. And it's changed for a host of reasons I won't go into now, but it's wonderful to see the Biden administration and others really be focused on this. And it's a place where AFT has extensive experience and knowledge. And as Ralph pointed out, I think we can help lead the way here. But I want to read something. It's in the foreword to the book. Bill Riley very, very graciously agreed to write the foreword to the book. Bill, of course, former president of the World Wildlife Fund, former former EPA administrator, and for us, most importantly, a former AFT board chair for many years. And he wrote this in the foreword to the book: "The current class of climate activists could learn a lesson or two from how AFT has approached its work over the years." I want each of you to just comment on that. Give me your take on what lessons from the past could really help to propel societal changes around climate change. Whoever wants to go first, jump in.
I'd be happy to jump in on that, and because that way I can steal Don's thunder here. I think it's the things we've been talking about. We've been talking about collaboration. Clearly this is a pretty wide spectrum on this issue, and there's a large middle ground, and we need to work with the partners who are willing to take risks within their own organizations, right? The people who see that there's opportunity here to work together. I think, clearly we need to do more research to document. I'm always a little uneasy when policy moves ahead of the facts. And AFT has been known for getting the facts before we move ahead. And our Center for Agriculture and Environment, headed by Dr. Ann Sorensen for all those years, was crucial to our policy work, getting the facts. So collaboration, facts, and back to my point about fairness, coming up with solutions and ideas that we can test that are built around fairness, sharing the responsibility of getting to the next level.
Don?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, we got 8 billion people on the planet. I think When World War II started, there were like maybe 2 or 2.5, and I don't think we get along any better now than we did then. So 8 billion people going on 10 billion is kind of scary. And all of those people eat, and as you say, they all live here. So, we have problems, and climate is high amongst them. And I think really the lessons are obviously that we need to learn to respect one another and to collaborate. One of the nice things about respect is that it's actually something you can offer someone else without necessarily first demanding that they offer it to you. And many times when people receive respect, they respond to that. So to me, that's the hope right there. That's where the hope lies, in that corner. And that turns on kind of 2 other things, really. I think that frequently there are 2 things I hear in respect to environmental issues, especially because they are so fundamental. They are earth-wide. They, especially like climate, they're issues that are existential for humans. So it's easy to make a statement like, well, cost isn't an issue. We've got to solve this problem. Cost is not an issue. Cost is always an issue. If you don't look out for cost, you can't afford to solve the problem. And when people respond to the need to solve a problem, the very first place they look is how much is it going to cost? Cost is also an issue because it's through cost that you understand fairness. And fairness is always an issue. It's also easy to say, well, and it doesn't matter who gets hurt. We got to get, people should just get out of the way. We got to get this solved. It always matters who gets hurt. And the fact of the matter is, if some group thinks that they're being taken advantage of, that they're being asked to bear burdens and share and pay out in response and deal responsibility with that they don't owe, that's somebody else's duty or responsibility, and they're bearing that burden, they will fight. I'm sorry, they will fight you to the last breath. So you've got to make at least some kind of effort to make sure that you look at cost and that you allocate that responsibility in a way that's fair. And I got to say, if you don't, the first thing that they will always do is they will say, hey, this problem doesn't exist. And they will do research. They will come up with anything that they can come up with to show you that the problem you want to solve does not exist. And I'm sorry, but I personally think climate is kind of an example of that, what we've experienced in the public debate over climate. And so that it's really, really important that we always appreciate cost, that we always make our very best effort to allocate the burdens of fixing things fairly amongst people. And to do that, to me, that means we've got to collaborate. We've got to have mutual respect and collaborate. So if I were going to think of something, that would be where I land.
Well, some of the same themes keep coming up: collaboration, fairness, important things we're supposed to have learned in kindergarten, but don't always necessarily continue. I have one final question for each of you, and I'm going to begin with you, Ralph. You really have a unique perspective. Not only all your time at AFT, but you've been a working farmer most of your life. You've really witnessed this whole movement. You were there at the beginning, and you're still active today. So my question for you is, what, in your opinion, is AFT's greatest legacy to date? And where do you think either AFT or the movement is headed from here?
Yeah.
Big question.
Yeah, that is a big question. I actually think that there are components to the legacy, such as it is, of AFT. One is, I think, consistency of the vision and strategy. This is not, in spite of the temptations to jump on the latest hot issue, and at some expense to fundraising and other initiatives, AFT's been consistent in working on the components of a sustainable farming system. And so I think that's one piece of our legacy. I think the really important piece is the focus on the middle ground. When it would have been easy to go off in one direction or another, as issues come and go, or as politics shifts from one extreme to another. AFT's done a pretty good job of staying pretty close to the center of our strategy, of the middle ground, of respecting both the farm community and the economic hardships that agriculture faces almost constantly, as well as the important needs to keep improving the quality of the planet that we live on. And I think those are really important components, part of the legacy of the organization. I don't think there's a need to shift much going forward. I think the conflicts will continue to exist, partly because we live in a nation that has a high respect for private property. We live in a capitalistic system that recognizes the value of things. And going forward, I think we have to do more to quantify the hard to quantify things, and bring that value down to current circumstances. And that's not easy. I'm talking more about climate change here than anything. It's a hard one to quantify, and it's a hard one to make meaningful to current generation. We say a lot of nice things about saving the planet for future generations, but we act on the current situation. So I think AFT has a real role there and that means pulling all of our components together around this issue.
Yeah, well, that's a great insights to help guide us moving forward. Don, for you, I want to ask a more personal question as your final question. This book is a history. It's also a guidebook of sorts for an effective advocacy organization, but it's more than that. It's also it talks a lot about the people and what inspired them and what motivated them and what they did. And the passion comes through. And I know you are very passionate about this topic as well. And you can't hide in your writing that it comes through. So this must have been a bit of a personal journey for you as well. And I'd love to hear some reflections from you on what this book has meant to you.
Well, you're right, actually. It was great to do, and I very much appreciate, by the way, you're suggesting that I do it. I appreciate it a lot.
Sometimes I have good suggestions. My staff sometimes thinks otherwise.
But I mean, sort of all my life I've been a person that kind of would prefer to cooperate than fight, and that's probably sort of built in. I maybe took to AFT a little bit like a duck to water for that reason. The book writing was absolutely a voyage of discovery. I hate in some ways to admit to my former boss that how little I really understood during those 11 years that I worked for AFT, how little I really did understand about some of this history and where AFT had been and what, in fact, it had accomplished. Even when I worked for the conservation districts, we were working with these farm bill programs, incentive programs all the time. Incentive-based conservation was the big key word. For crying out loud, that was brand new. Stuff was brand new at the time, or relatively new. And all of that was kind of a big surprise to me. So this was absolutely a kind of a voyage of discovery. I got a chance to reconnect with colleagues to explore kind of what had happened in the past and why. And I guess in the end, I just got blown away when among the things I didn't know, I'm sorry, but I just did not know it. I was not aware of how significant the 1985 Farm Bill was. And when I finally realized what had happened at that time, and then, as Ralph says, it just starts there. It just starts there. I mean, it built, Farm Bill after Farm Bill after Farm Bill, right up to and including the most recent ones. This has just built, and it's just amazing. It's nothing less than sort of startling. And one of the reasons it's startling is even now today, AFT is a relatively small and surprisingly unknown organization. And yet it's accomplishing miracles. I know that kind of a part of the collaborative strategy is that AFT never takes credit. And I'm pretty sure I've violated that rule in this book, big time, and so I apologize to that for that. But it deserves a lot of credit, and it is a linchpin organization for a great deal of this that has happened. And I got to say, I'm more than delighted to take all the credit that I can get for writing this book, but I did not write the story that this book tells. That story was written by thousands of people. It was written by AFT board members, by AFT staffers over all of those years. And more, it was written by all of those partners, hundreds, maybe thousands of them all over the country. Organizations that AFT spun off, organizations that AFT dealt with and worked with and collaborated with in the policy arenas, state, local, federal, and it's still happening today. Right here in Washington, we had a bill passed, a climate bill passed. John, I'm sure you know about it because I suspect I hope Addie has been bragging to you about it. This is the first time Washington State has ever, aside from one occasion I remember back in the 90s, but since then, this is the first time Washington State has ever, as a state, actually funded conservation practices on agricultural lands. And it's the purpose of doing
around
it,
the country now.
and it's just what Ralph is talking about. It's for climate. They get the climate stuff, and so bang, they're willing to do it. And that's just a remarkable achievement. So like I say, I didn't write the story. The story was written by thousands of amazing people, including the two of you. And I think that's who deserves one heck of a lot of appreciation from all of us for what has happened and for what I absolutely know is going to happen in the future.
Well, Don, thank you for your efforts of documenting it and getting it down. And it is a huge contribution to both history and, as I said, I call it a guidebook. I think it's be very useful for organizations going forward that are trying to be effective in this space. And if somebody's listening to this and you've gotten a sense of what we're talking about, but want the detail, get a copy of the book, read it. It's fascinating, it's hopeful, and it's useful. And you can do that through American Farmland Trust's website or directly from the publisher, which is Island Press. But thank you both so much for taking the time, and more importantly, just thank you for all you've done for the cause. And your great-grandchildren will thank you.
I hope so, yes. It's been a pleasure, John.
Yeah, likewise, Ralph. Thank you, John.
Thank you both.